Hello, welcome to the 21-day family connections experiment. We are so happy to have you here with us today for our very first interview in July. We are excited to be with Tiffany Clark, an author, a podcaster, and someone who loves family history. Before we get started, I thought we would do something fun in the comments. So this month, we have our cultural connections plan where you get to learn about your heritage and more of the context of your ancestors' life. So I thought it'd be fun if you could put where your ancestors are from in the comments. And if you want to do the little emoji flags, those are super fun too. So go ahead and tell us where you're watching from. And if you have learned anything cool during these past 7 days. And then one other quick announcement before I bring Tiffany in. If you haven't heard, in September, we are doing a DNA plan and we are super excited about it. You will want your DNA results back so that you can just dive right in. So make sure if you haven't already taken a DNA test to get that taken. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Tiffany in.
Hello.
Welcome. I am so
Thank you.
excited to have Tiffany here. We've known each other for I think at least 8 years.
Probably at least that long.
Yes, I moved into her neighborhood and got to know her through book club and church, and I discovered we have a lot of the same interests and that she does really cool stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself, Tiffany.
Well, hello. I am Tiffany Clark, like Tara said, and I am a little bit of everything sometimes. I love family history, and I am an author. I have 10 books that I've published out in the world and many more on my computer that will someday make it out into the world. And I have a podcast that started about a year ago. It was a year ago this month. It's called Additional History Headlines You Probably Missed. And it's a lot of fun because I look in newspapers on famous dates in history, something like the Titanic sinking or Pearl Harbor being bombed, important dates. And then I tell you what else was being reported in newspapers on the exact same day. And I have 4 kids. The oldest just graduated from high school, and the youngest is still in elementary, so we have quite a mix. But they're a lot of fun. I like being a mom, and I like to play the violin and piano, and I've done a lot of stuff with music for that.
Yeah. Awesome. I love how your love of history has taken you so many different directions, from the podcast to the books. I didn't realize you had 10 books. I have some reading to catch up on. I love you have a series based in like Massachusetts, like New England area, right? And I
Yes.
loved that one. It was so good. So now I've got some reading to do. But it's fun that it's kind of your love of family history has gone through podcasts and writing and then of course sharing with your kids too. Being a mom is important. So along those lines, when and how, maybe why did your love of family history begin?
That's a good question, because I think for me it was maybe a little different than for how it would be for a lot of people. I was a stay-at-home mom. I had 2 toddler little boys and not much else to do. It was before I started writing books. I don't know, it was 16, 17 years ago. And I was kind of bored, and I thought, well, there was the indexing thing going on, and I thought, well, I'll try that out. And I thought, well, I should maybe learn a little bit about my own family history. So I started putting all the data into my system and mostly just copying what everybody else had done and that was already out there. And that was kind of boring. It was nothing but just transferring data from one place to another. And eventually I started realizing I should learn their stories and learn what makes them tick. I love history. I love learning things. And I started doing the research of the actual people myself, and I loved it. I was hooked right from then.
Yeah, it's those stories. I totally get it. Those stories get us. And I remember I remember one of the times we got together, you had some really cool, like, I'm trying to remember what documents they were from one of your ancestors' Rexburg hometowns. Were they like I'm trying to remember if they're like their grades or something. Do you remember that?
Yes. I think my grandma had just passed away, and my aunts and my mom were going to throw away a box of stuff. And I said, well, could I look in it first? And one of the little tiny cards in there was my great grandfather's report card. And it actually turned out to give a little clue to the family history because it was signed by his mother, my great great grandmother. And my aunt said, we never knew what she went by. We didn't know if she went by her first name or her middle name. So they kind of got a clue to that by the way she signed her name on his report card.
That's so awesome. I just remembered that, and I remembered loving it because I have some Rexburg roots too. So you never know when you're going to find these clues to your family. It's so fun. Now you mentioned your podcast. I'm going to put that banner up again really quick. I love your podcast. I put it on like while I'm cleaning and listen to it because I'm a newspaper person. My background's in journalism, so I love hearing these headlines and about these dates that my ancestors would have been alive for. So, what got you interested in this topic? What led you to creating your podcast?
So it was actually family history that led me to start the podcast because I had been looking through newspapers, looking for ancestors' names, seeing what I could come up with. And as I usually do, I got sidetracked by some of the unique headlines that were written and, about murders or romance or weird little tells. And I'd start reading them and then I'd be like, well, I wonder what happened. So then I'd search the newspapers to find how it ended. And next thing I know, I just spent an hour on something that had nothing to do with any of my family. But I pretty soon had this collection of stories and from history that had nothing to do with anything. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll figure out a way to put these in a book. I'm a writer. I can do that. But it just didn't have the right feel. And I'd been listening to a lot of podcasts and I thought, I think this maybe should be a podcast of all these random stories from history. And so I decided I'd do it based on famous historical dates. And it kind of ballooned from there.
It's so fun. I love it. And I love how you have the dates. Like, if you knew, well, of course we know the times our ancestors were alive. You could totally head over to Tiffany's podcast, look for dates where your ancestors could have been alive or areas they could have been in and listen to it and hear about that time in their life. I love it. It's so fun. And then plus the history side of it. I love just the general history too. So exciting. So as you've done this podcast, what are some of your favorite stories? Like, what are the things that have stood out to you?
There's so many that I really like. One of them that I liked came from, I think it was the day the Civil War started. So it would have been back in 1861. So it was a pretty old newspaper, but I found the story in multiple papers. So it was being passed around. And it was the story of a man who had been in the army in France, and he was French, and he had done his time and decided to re-enlist. And by re-enlisting, he got a big sum of money. And I think it amounted to about 5,000 US dollars. So for nowadays. Yeah. So a bunch, but not enough to live for very long on. And he decided he was going to make the most of that. He was going to go out in the town. He was going to find a woman to enjoy it with. So he found, his name was Corporal Ruard, and he found a woman named Denise. She was 17 years old, and she worked in a factory where she made silk flowers. That was her job. They, put them in the bonnets and the hats back then. So they were pretty popular. And he met her and they hit it off. And right away, after like a day of knowing each other, he said, hey, let's get married. And she said, what? And he said, I've got this money. As soon as it's gone, we'll just have fun till it's gone. When it's gone, I'll divorce you. You'll be done with me. Oh, so this 17-year-old girl agreed to marry Corporal Ruard. And And the two went crazy. They went out to dinner, they got an apartment, and they spent all the money pretty fast. The problem was he realized he was in love with her, and she realized she was in love with him, and they didn't want to let each other go, but they had no money, no way to live because they'd been crazy and spent it all. So they made a pact to commit suicide together. Yeah, it's a little. And I will say too that if you read your history, suicide was kind of like a trendy in thing back then. It was really dramatic, and it's kind of sad. But they decided that at 10:52 p.m. they were going to go to this restaurant that had private rooms, and they were going to kill each other. So she even told people at work that what she was going to do, and they didn't believe her. They thought she was being crazy. Mm-hmm. And comes down time, and Corporal Ruard, stabbed Denise in the chest. Oh, and she was laying on the couch in their little restaurant room, bleeding all over, and he stabs himself in the chest. And the waiter comes in a little while later and finds them, and they're both dead. Oh, and it's a very Romeo Juliet type thing. Yeah. But as we know, newspapers don't always get it right. And when I read a whole bunch of other articles on it, the truth was she didn't die when he stabbed her, and he didn't die when he stabbed himself. And the waiter came in and just found a bloody mess of people who didn't quite kill themselves. And so they went to the hospital, and she ended up dying 20 days later. She only made it for about 3 weeks, but he survived and was on trial. And that's why it was actually being reported in the newspaper, not the way the Americans got it. They kind of changed the story. And he was actually acquitted. They figured it was this lover's pact. But I really liked that one because it was just so unique and so 1800s.
Yeah, well, and it's so different, and it's like a who would have expected it back then? Yeah, like it's just so crazy. It's like your true crime podcast right now, but set in the 1800s, and you never know what you are going to discover.
Exactly,
things like that. Wow. Yeah. Now I want to go look up these people on like what happened to Colonel Ruard next. That's so crazy. So obviously you have done a lot of research in the newspapers. What tips do you have for someone that wants to see if there are any crazy stories or interesting stories? How could they get started looking in the newspapers for their ancestors?
Well, I actually wrote down 10 different tips that you can use for looking up things in the newspapers, find about your ancestors, because I think some of them are overlooked. And it's a lot easier nowadays because I remember as a teenager looking up on microfiche and scrolling through it page after page in the local library. And it wasn't very easy. It wasn't very... you couldn't find information unless you knew it was there and you knew to look for it in the first place. But now so many newspapers, I mean, like I said, even from the 1800s are digitized, and you can go back and search by name. Ancestry.com, familysearch.com. My favorite is newspapers.com. They're all so many more. And you can get free trials at those places too if you want to give it a shot before you purchase. So my first tip, and I hope it's obvious to most people to look, is the obituaries, because that's where you're going to find so much information. You not only are you going to find out about the person that's deceased, but you're going to find out how many kids they had and what their names are. Most likely you'll find those kids' spouses' names as well, which can open up whole new lines. You can find where they lived, when they were born, where they died. So much information just from the obituaries. And I think most people do look there, but that's not it. So the second place I would say to look is the marriage records. You can find, of course, the marriage dates in it. But one thing that is so important that you can find in a marriage record is maiden names. And Tara, I'm sure you know that people in newspapers back in the day, and I talk about this on my podcast all the time. So I would be known as Mrs. Jeff Clark. My first name wouldn't be given. My maiden name wouldn't be given. It's really hard to find people's maiden names sometimes. And it's a marriage record usually has their first name and their maiden name. So that's a great place. Look up the spouse's name for a marriage record and then see if you can find the woman's name that way. Yeah. And one thing, you can often find unique things. Recently, I found my great aunt's marriage record from the 1940s. And I didn't realize that her husband had been a Harvard professor at the time they got married. I had no idea, not a clue. And I just thought they were Idaho people all the time since I knew them.
The Harvard man.
Yeah. And I also found out she had served in LDS mission, and all of that was in their marriage announcement. So there could be little tidbits you might not hear about other places if you look in those. Let's see. And then number 3, as sad as it is, the divorce records. Yeah. Sometimes we find out about marriages, but we don't always realize that a couple has been divorced. So double check those. Sometimes you'll find something, sometimes you won't. Hopefully you won't, right? I have actually found some that had previous marriages I didn't know about by looking in divorce records. And then number 4 is pretty easy. Look in the birth records. Yeah. I know that even my name was in the newspaper back when I was born and listed my parents' names. So sometimes you can get clues about your ancestors that way.
And sometimes they have pictures.
Yes.
A picture of my dad when he was a baby in the birth.
That's awesome. I know my husband does not have very many pictures, and I think I've only ever seen one of him as a baby. He was born in Mexico, and they just didn't have cameras back then and down there. And yeah, that would be an awesome thing to see. And then number 5, kind of we touched about this a minute ago, is school records. We talked about my grandpa's report card. And you can also find graduation records. And a lot of times they'll have pictures accompany if it's a small graduating class. And I found my parents' names, mostly my mother, on the honor roll records. Oh, and I also twice found my mother's name that she had once performed at the retirement of one of her teachers, and she sang a song. I don't know that my mother has ever sang for me, so I had no idea she did that. And then another time I found she had performed a flute solo somewhere, and I've never heard her play the flute. I knew she had played it in school, but I've never heard it. And I found both of my parents' names in the papers for 4-H records. That's a big thing. Anything in state fairs, county fairs, you're going to find names. And my mom won the 5th grade spelling bee, I found out through the newspaper. That was fun. Yes. So there's a lot of things just from like the schools and the awards presentations to look at. And then number 6 is going to be military records. You can find a lot of the times the cities will feature different people that are serving in the military from their town, and they'll do an entire write-up on that person. And other times it might just be a simple that they were transferred from this base to this base. And you can find that records and follow where they went. Sadly, you're going to find the POW and MIA records as well, but that's just as important to find.
Yeah, part of their story.
Exactly. And then number 7, this, newspapers don't always report the good things. So far, what I've said is mostly good, but there's bad too, right? And so you're going to want to check the arrest and court records. We know our ancestors weren't perfect, right? We would like them to be, but they weren't. So like my dad, he was a fun teenager. He was homecoming king. He was involved in athletics, but apparently he was also a speeder, because I found multiple records of him getting speeding tickets, and that was printed in the newspaper.
Wow,
and I love to tease him about it. Yeah. And so, I can be like, well, when I was a teen, you can't get mad at me for anything I did. And then in another article about a court record, I found out that my grandpa, who I grew up next door to, and he told me all kinds of stories about his childhood. I thought I knew him really well, but he had really bad eyesight, and I didn't know why. I just assumed it was old age. but I found a court record article saying that he was suing his insurance company to pay for his treatment because he'd been in a snowmobile accident and lost the sight in one of his eyes. Back in the 70s, I had no idea that was what had happened. I grew up on snowmobiles with him, and I still didn't realize that was why he was blind in one eye. And then sadly, like my husband, I was researching one of his family lines and found out that one of his distant cousins was murdered by her husband on the way home from a family reunion when they got in a fight in the car.
Oh, so awful.
It was awful. It was a total shock when I read that one. Mm-hmm. So, like I said, it's not always pleasant, but it's still interesting. And luckily that was a distant relative, so didn't lose a lot of sleep over it.
Yeah. Yeah, you just never know what you're going to
know. And then number 8 is probably one of my absolute favorite things to look for in the newspaper, and that's the town news. Because all the little towns out in the area of any big town, they're going to report things going on. And they didn't just report the big things. They reported so-and-so had a visitor. So-and-so's out of town this week. And they would tell you exactly when the people were, when and where they were coming back. So you could rob them if you wanted. I can't believe that.
Good thing we don't do that as much anymore.
I know, right? There was one guy that reported that he'd gotten 4 stitches because he cut his thumb. I mean, they published the minorest thing in the newspaper. And some of those things I found were that in 1935, my grandma had a slumber party when she was 17. And that was written in the newspaper. And let's see what else. Yeah, just a lot of little things like that. Even if you bought something, it was going to be reported in the newspaper. So you kind of had to watch yourself.
Yeah, like someone's always watching.
Yeah, exactly. And then the last thing, well, not the last, but number 9, I kind of already touched on this before with the maiden names. Check all versions of the names. My grandpa's name was Robert Alexander Erickson. And in one case, I found my grandma mentioned in the newspaper under Mrs. Alex Erickson. I don't remember her or my grandpa ever going by Alex. It was Robert or Bob all the time. Mm-hmm. But somebody had talked about her under the name Alex. Oh. So try every version you can think of, including the spouse's names, and that might help you to get it. And then the last thing, the last number 10 tip is if you can't find anything, but you know for sure that your family lived there, read the newspapers anyway. There might be fun town celebrations they had. Maybe their town was really good at some war effort, or maybe their school band was really good, or their football team always won state. Just see what it was, see what the culture was in the town, and you'll still be able to learn about your ancestor, even if you can't find their actual name. So those are my 10 tips.
I love those. Those are such good tips and so fun to try. Like, I'm excited to go back and dig through newspapers a little bit more. A couple years ago, I found one for my husband's side of the family. His great-great-grandfather won a costume contest in the 4th of July parade up in Utah. And he was this tall man. And I'm like, where's the picture? I need the picture for what Ollie, I think it was Ollie Johnson. Like, what did he dress up as? That was so good. That well, actually, he didn't win. It was second place. So it wasn't quite good enough, but it's just fun to have that context because
right.
We knew him as a miner and we found some other cool articles about him too. But that was just so random that, and he won the costume contest, or not won. I'm speaking falsehoods. He came close to winning. But yeah, I love what you can find there. So many good tips. Let's see. What other questions do we have for you? So we've talked a lot about what you've discovered in newspapers and about your podcast from your own family history. And you've actually mentioned a lot from your own family history as well. But is there anyone specifically from your own family history who has inspired you?
I have to say, and I didn't know about this until maybe a year and a half ago, but my great grandma Jensen was actually one of the newspaper reporters in town for like 30 something years, I believe it was. I don't know how it hadn't come up before this time period, but I was reading about her, and she was the one that wrote the town news for Burton, Idaho. And she was the one that would have, yeah, she was the one that would have been writing, so and so had a visitor, so and so's out of town. My great grandma was the town gossip, and I had no idea, but I loved that I had that connection to newspapers through her.
Yeah, like no wonder you find it so interesting because that's what she did too. Oh, I love that. That's so fun. So, have you been able to read like her articles and stuff? Have you seen those newspapers?
I've seen a little clip here and there, but it's on my to-do list is too, because I haven't had access to those archives yet. I need to actually go to the town and find them. So that's my goal sometime in the next few months is to do that.
Have a little road trip. That's fun.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Just picturing her with her reporter's notebook. Looking out the window.
Yep.
So as you've done this and as you've done your research and explored history, what kind of impact has it had on your life? Have there been any positive benefits from these discoveries and exploration that you've done?
I think it has had a positive impact. It gives me an outlet for my creativity and to do all this research. I'm the weirdo that's always liked research. I guess the research part of papers is more fun than the writing. And I think it's also helped me to share stories with my children. When I find interesting things, I can't wait to be like, hey, guess what I found out about this person, or guess what I read in the newspaper today. So I don't know how much they appreciate, but I hope someday that they'll look back and be like, I have really cool ancestors. I'm glad my mom told me about them.
Well, and I bet they will. And how cool will it be for them and all of their descendants to have your podcast too? Like that's your voice talking about history. Like I just think that will be awesome. I love it whenever I can find voice recordings of my ancestors, and
I agree.
we'll have a lot. So that's good. Well, I have like so many more questions for you, but we're running short on time. So, is there anything else that we didn't cover that you'd like to add before we wrap up? I put your website there. You guys should go and check it out. You can look more at her books, find out more about the podcast and all these exciting things she has going on. Then I'll let you talk, Tiffany. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I think I'm good. I just go out and don't be afraid to look at the newspapers. You never know what you're going to find.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. You've gotten me excited about newspapers and about headlines. I'm excited to listen to more of your podcast. We're so grateful you were here with us today. And
thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And with that, we'll wrap up. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.